When you don't want to draw something new and want to gain clarity about the improvements and stylistic choices you made in your art over time, you can take an old piece of your art and redraw it, or you could take characters other people designed and draw them yourself as long as they allow redrawing them. You could approach drawing from or looking at others or your own old art in many different ways. I've seen YouTube videos made about this concept titled Drawing Characters in My Style, Redesigning Characters, Reimagining Characters, Redrawing Art, Critiquing Art, Roasting Art, Fixing Art, and so on. Hi, here's May, and for today's video I'm redrawing an old piece of my art. When it comes to redrawing art, the idea is to take an art piece and draw it how you would currently draw the same elements depicted in it. You could change up the pose and other elements if you want to, but you don't have to. Now onto the piece I decided to redraw. I went with a piece from 2 years ago. There I drew a space-themed character, and for the pose I used a photo reference I had from an old photo I took of my young brother. Okay, now onto the process of redrawing the art. I'll talk about how I drew elements like proportions, colors and shading in the old and new versions along the way. Let's start with the sketch. In my old art, the proportions of the character weren't looking very off, probably because I had my photo reference. Stylistically, I would say this art looks less wrong than some of the art I drew afterwards. It's very simple, but the proportions are not that off. For later pieces, the anatomy, especially the body's proportions, were way too thin. It looks less appealing to me. Because of this, I also thought about doing a fixing art video about one of the illustrations from a later time in the future, since then I could point out more mistakes. For a lot of my old art, I would say the proportions and anatomy look off, since I would often not use references or just very few. For this piece, I had my photo reference though. Over time, I've learned that at first, before starting a project, as well as while I'm drawing, when I'm struggling on something, it's important to look up references right away. In my new version, I started out with a thumbnail sketch of the pose. You'll also see I sketched in some hand bones along the way. At the time of drawing this, I was learning about hand anatomy, so I wanted to test my knowledge here. The pose was a bit difficult to draw to me, since the head should rest on the hand, but I didn't want the head to be too low. At the same time, it would have too much foreshortening to me that way. Then I compared the proportions I sketched in to what I drew in my old version, and I adjusted the body a bit. The head shape I used was a lot less rounded, including a slightly wider, more rounded chin. The face overall was also thinner. Over time, these are stylistic changes in how I draw faces I made. While sketching the head, I drew the features, especially the nose and eyes, differently from my reference. The nose now is just one line and the eyes are a lot more detailed and don't have as much of a tall, squarish shape. The hairstyle didn't make any sense to me in the old version. For drawing hair, it should all come from a hairline or hair growth spot. Hair strands should follow the head's form and direction because of this. While the hair looks like this big mass and the hair strand shapes don't look that nice to me. In the newer version, I made sure to at first understand how the hair would work, where the hair growth spot would be and where the hair would flow from. Then I first sketched the bigger shapes, also focusing on the whole silhouette the hair would be forming. Afterwards, I added some smaller hair strands as well. The hair as well as the hands would be some of my weakest points in my old illustration. For drawing the newer hands, I made sure they had free functioning finger joints and I included some fingernails. While sketching the hoodie, I included a lot more folds. The clothes look more detailed in the newer version. Before I move on to the line art, I like to fill in the head and hair silhouette to check if their volumes and the face symmetry works. Since this head was from a frontal angle, I struggled a lot with its symmetry. I took around 30 minutes for trying to fix the head shape. With some illustrations, I almost immediately go with my initial sketch, while for other ones, even after mirroring my art many times, I'm still not happy with how the face looks. After I had adjusted the head and hair, I went on to the line art stage. In my old illustration, the lines were pretty thick and had very little variation in line thickness. All the lines also have the same opacity. Back then I used a very different brush from what I currently use for line art. My current line art brush has varying line thickness, opacity and a bit of texture. My lines also are a lot thinner. I made the silhouette lines around the face and hair a bit thicker, while details like hair strands or the fingernails have lines that are a lot thinner. You will see I also drew in ears for the newer illustration. In my old one they are probably covered up by the hair, or I just didn't want to or forgot to draw them. Oops. For the fingers I used 3 separate lines to portray each joint. I also drew some lines on the hoodie's sleeves to show the seams of them. For the hood of this hoodie, I found in my old illustration it looked very simple and just like a shape on the head. The hood also was covering up the whole neck and shoulders. In my redraw, I wanted the hoodie to really look like it's laying on the head, clearly separating the outside and inside part of it, and I decided I wanted to draw the hood a bit more loose so that a part of the neck would still be visible. I added in small earrings and a space logo on the hoodie to give the outfit a bit more detail. Now onto coloring. For this I had my old art as a reference and I tried to have the colors match up with it from just looking at my art. You can test how good you are at perceiving colors by looking at art and trying to pick the same colors you see there yourself. You can create a color palette from the art, for example. Then you can compare this to the actual colors by color picking, and you can make the whole illustration as well as the other art black and white to see if the values match up. While I didn't want to use the exact same colors necessarily, I still like the color scheme. I just sometimes used a bit brighter pastel colors. One bigger difference between both illustrations is that in the newer one the skin color is more saturated and less bluish. Next up is shading. Overall I pretty much only used cell shading in my older illustration. It is made up of simple selected shapes that are a bit darker for the hair and skin, while for the hoodie sleeves I used a color dodge layer mode, which made the shaded areas there look brighter than the hoodie's colors. This is something I've almost never done in my illustrations, but it looked pretty nice with this character to me. In my redraw I added a lot more detailed shading for the skin, hair and eyes. You'll see I use a mix of cell and painterly shading. For the skin I like to add shadows around the nose and eyes. I also used a pinkish blush in my old illustration and replicated this in my new one. Usually I would go for a much more reddish orange color for adding blush, but with the color scheme in this illustration the pink worked pretty well. For the hair I like to make the shading follow the hair strands, separating them, and I tend to make the hair darkest around the hair growth spot as well as at the bottom of the head. For this illustration I also decided to add in some blue spots around the forehead. The eyes have a lot more detailed shading in the redraw. For shading the hoodie I mostly selected areas I would want to be in shadow and painted them in. In both my old and new illustration the light would come from the top left, shadows would fall on the right side this way. Something I did differently from my old illustration here though was to add an outline around shadow areas. Some artists like to do this and I myself included sometimes. It can give the art more of a watercolor feeling. I also added in a couple of bright blue spots on a overlay layer, a technique I was inspired by Woman ZZZ, an artist who I analyzed a while ago. I tried out a bunch of different layer modes to see what I liked the most, and I went with a combination of multiply and overlay blending modes in the end. I checked the values a couple of times since I wanted to make sure there would be a lot of contrast around the face and eyes, and that overlaps of the hoodie, for example the right arm and the torso, would be clearly separated. In my old illustration the sleeve and body have very similar values. Because I wanted to change this I added a small darker part for the torso, for example. Then I went on to the background. I don't draw backgrounds for my character illustrations often, but here I did. I wanted to replicate the background from my old illustration, but couldn't find the same brushes I used for drawing it. Because of this, I imported some images instead, but since I also didn't like how this looked too much, I also took parts of my old illustration and combined them with my new one, so most elements are very similar. Getting the background and character to look nice together, especially color-wise, was a bit difficult here. In my old illustration I used a lot of saturated colors. Value-wise it looked okay, and in the end I decided to just go with similar colors to my old illustration in my redraw. Something that's also unique and helped to make this character stand out from the background in my old illustration was the coloring of the lines. The character's silhouette is black, whereas inner lines are colored. I used to manually paint in the colors for lines by putting a clip layer on top of my line art. In my redraw I used a duplicated blurred copy of my color layer to color the lines. I also made the silhouette lines a bit thicker and darker afterwards, but not completely black. For fixing the art I first merged all my layers for the character, which makes it a lot faster when you want to do small adjustments and you can paint over parts that way. After I was done with the art, I wrote down a few things I would still want to change, which included adjusting the colors, the expression of the character, and the left hand. And I worked a bit more on these parts afterwards. It can be really helpful to look back on an illustration a few days after you finished it to spot mistakes you still want to fix, or you can just look at your old art to critique it and figure out potential weaknesses you currently have. If you want to, if it's worth your time, you can also fix it. For fixing the colors, I adjusted the background a bit and made the character have a lot more contrast and dark values, so they would stand out from the background more. The hand was a pretty big struggle in this illustration. I first tried to fix the old hand I drew, but to me it looked too much like it was pointing towards the viewer, so in the end I took a hand drawing from my hand anatomy studies and it had the angle I wanted for the newer hand, so I just drew over this hand sketch. And since I had merged the layer, I just painted in the outfit underneath. Now it looks like the head is touching the face and not resting that much on it. In the beginning I said I wanted the head to kind of rest on the hand, but in the end it turned out to look more like it is just barely touching the head. And that's it for the full process of my redraw. I talked a lot about how I used to portray elements in my art and how I draw them now. And here are stylistic changes I made over time that stand out to me. The proportions are less simplified and more realistic. The head and hands were a lot bigger in my old illustration. The character there looked much younger than in the redraw to me because of this. For the eyes, the iris is a lot rounder and the pupil smaller. The eye shape also is rather wide. Then we have the line art. In my old art I used thick lines. For the redraw, I used thinner lines with varying line thickness, opacity, and texture, which were all things that were not included in my old art. The coloring of the lines is also different. For the colors, I tend to use less saturated, pastel-y, purple colors in my art now than I did back then, but for this illustration, the colors look pretty similar. The character does have more contrast than the background in the redraw though. And for the shading, I shifted from just doing cell shading to also adding in some painterly shadows. And then we have the level of detail. You can really see this in the portrayal of the hair, eyes and hoodie. All the lines as well as the shading look more detailed. That would be some of the main differences to me. You can point out any other ones you noticed and also let me know about developments you've made in your art over time. As I said in the beginning, for the art in this video, I focused a lot on stylistic changes I made over time, since the old art I redrew didn't look too fundamentally wrong. When it comes to figuring out the improvements you made, especially art fundamental wise, it's best to take a piece where you can see a lot of mistakes. I'd probably do this in the future as well. I wanted to make this video as an experiment to try something new. It's not as focused on fan art and only includes a single illustration. If you want to, I could also make a video explaining my full illustration process, how I do the sketch, line art, color and shading phase in the future. I'd appreciate any feedback. Thanks for watching and bye.